we're focusing on Taiwan. And we're looking at what Professor Shelley Rigger has written a book about, how Taiwan was involved in helping to bring China, the People's Republic of China, to the position that it now occupies, with the world's second largest economy, rapidly growing, challenging the US in technology, challenging the world with its technological innovations in this way. Few people are as well equipped, well prepared to talk about this as Professor Rigger. She has written here a great work of history. It's full of political analysis, and it's also an economic primer on East Asia's development. You can get so much from this book. It draws on her research on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, and it begins with a puzzle. And so that's where she'll start. Professor Rigger is the Brown Professor of Political Science at Davidson College, a school in North Carolina, a highly selective institution. She's a graduate of Princeton and Harvard. She's done really quite a lot in a relatively brief career. She started by focusing on Islam in China, but shifted gears, focused on Taiwan, looked at Taiwan's democratization, its economic development, and of course, Taiwan's relationship with its giant neighbor and its relationship with the world. We have been really fortunate to have her with us on a couple of occasions. She introduced her 2011 book, and you can watch the video from that a little bit later, not right now. That book is Why Taiwan Matters: Small Island Global Powerhouse. And it's a really important contribution to our understanding about Taiwan and its place in the world. But she's written many other studies about Taiwan. She may have been one of the first writing in English to focus on generational change and what that might mean in Taiwan. So take a look at her several books. She is a distinguished scholar, an accomplished educator, and an important public intellectual. She's somebody who speaks to Congress. She participates in the training of military officers, and we have her with us today. So friends, we are really happy that you are with us to hear from Professor Shelley Rigger talking about the tiger leading the dragon. We want you to be part of this conversation too. So take advantage of that Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Go to the bottom of that Zoom screen, click on that Q&A button to share with us your question. We'll put links to Professor Rigger's books and things like that in the chat, but please, to get to us, post your question in the Q&A section. So without further ado, let's turn to Professor Shelley Rigger. Shelley, thank you for joining us today.
Well, it is so much my pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my introduction of this new book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. Let's see. So we all remember this kind of image, right? The spectacular transformation of Shanghai from 1980 to 2006. And actually that particular stretch of road probably looks fairly similar now in 2021, but just the incredible transformation of China in a very short period of time, from a primarily agricultural and very poorly resourced and isolated country and economy to this bustling central feature of the global economy. And really, even by 2006, already well on its way to becoming the factory to the world. And one of the ways that we can also visualize, some people like to look at the pictures and visualize it that way. Other people want to look at a graph and visualize it this way. But, this just shows us the magnitude of China's transformation, specifically measured by its exports, so its contribution to the global economy. And of course, a major inflection point for China economically was joining the WTO at the end of 2000, early 2001, when you see this incredible acceleration in China's export growth. But this graph, the scale of the y-axis disguises something that I think is actually really important, and that's this trajectory. So even before joining the WTO, China's export growth was really impressive. And while it did accelerate even faster in subsequent years, even 1978 to 2000 tells a pretty interesting story. So just as 2001 is an inflection point with the WTO, we're left with this question even before 2001. How did the PRC, this country that had no private property as of 1976, no business in the sense in which we understand business in the West, how did the PRC become the factory to the world by the mid to late 2000s? And, you know, the WTO is part of it, but here's another part of it. In 1987, for the first time, Taiwanese were allowed to travel to the PRC. And almost immediately, traveling to the PRC, they recognized the economic opportunities that the PRC's reform and opening, which began in 1978, offered to them. And so I would say that if 2001 is an inflection point, 1987 is also one. And while, you know, it may take a little time for these trends to really be reflected in the data, by 1993, there's already a significant upward spike in China's exports. So my answer, the answer that I am going to defend, perhaps put forward tonight, to how the PRC became the factory to the world, is that a very significant factor in that transformation was foreign direct investment, and specifically manufacturing-oriented and export-oriented manufacturing-oriented investment, largely by ethnic Chinese from overseas. Hong Kong investors played a really important role, but I think there is a uniquely significant contribution that we haven't really talked about enough from Taiwanese investors, or the people who are called in China, Taishang. And here they are. Actually, these are not Taishang. These are people who play Taishang on TV, because by 2012, the phenomenon of Taiwanese investors, Taiwanese business people being in the mainland, doing business, was such a big deal, and something that was so intriguing and fascinating to PRC citizens, that there's actually this television show, kind of business soap opera called Taishang. So Taiwanese have changed the PRC in many ways. The contributions that they have made have had an enormous influence on the PRC economy. You know, Foxconn, it's just too easy. I got to find another photograph because everybody knows Foxconn, but there are literally thousands of companies, obviously none of them on the scale of Foxconn, but thousands of companies, Taiwanese companies, that have had a really profound effect on different PRC communities. But it's not only the economy that has been affected by the introduction of Taiwanese influences into the PRC. I also, in the book, talk about, and tonight I want to just give you a little bit of a taste of the ways in which Taiwanese investors, students, dependents, workers have affected the culture and lifestyles in the PRC as well. So how have they done this? Well, by bringing Taiwan's experience of export-oriented manufacturing development to the mainland. So in Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear, remember, you guys are in Southern California, so you all are Buzz Lightyear fans, I'm sure. Buzz Lightyear thinks that he's a real guy, like a real spaceman, but he's actually a plastic toy. And how does he find out? How does he make this shocking discovery about himself? He finds inside of his glove the words "Made in Taiwan." And then he knows, oh my gosh, I really am just a plastic toy. So the joke there, of course, is that for people of a certain age, my age, growing up, things like plastic toys, small electronics, like the transistor radios that everybody put under their pillows so we could listen to baseball games and music at night after we were supposed to be lights out. All that kind of stuff came with "Made in Taiwan" stamped on it somewhere. But of course, today, all of that stuff, even literally your Buzz Lightyear's toy, is made in China. And I think there's a really important story to be told here, which is how Taiwanese manufacturers who were making this kind of item right up until the late 1980s transferred that manufacturing process, that the specific manufacturing of actual stuff, but also all of the things that go along with that kind of export-oriented manufacturing to the PRC. So in order to really make sense of this story, I need to tell you a little something about how Taiwan became the place where plastic toys and small electronics and so on were manufactured. And it really begins in the Japanese colonial period, so 1895 to 1945, when Taiwan was part of the Empire of Japan. There was already, even then, an effort to upgrade Taiwan's infrastructure for some basic manufacturing or basic industrial tasks, mainly agricultural processing. So this is a sugar mill back in the day. Then after Taiwan became detached from the Japanese Empire and was handed over to the Republic of China, so the government as of the end of World War II that was in power throughout mainland China, which soon thereafter lost mainland China to the Communist Party. But shortly after that transfer of power from the Japanese Empire to this Chinese-led leadership, Taiwan underwent a very important agricultural revolution, which was rooted in a land reform, a land to the tiller land reform that greatly accelerated Taiwan's capital accumulation. So you had small family businesses that were originally farms, but as people began to accumulate capital through this sharp increase in productivity, thanks to the land reform, they began to create small and medium-sized enterprises for manufacturing. So in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, Taiwan became this island of tiny workshops where all kinds of products were made for export under other brands. So Taiwan did not develop very many of its own brands, but what Taiwan had a lot of was contract manufacturing for exports. So this is a bicycle factory, and it kind of looks like any Taiwanese factory in the 1980s, or even this one's probably from the early 90s. Small scale, out in the countryside, pretty low technology, and the boss is on the factory floor doing the work alongside the employees. In 1987, President Jiang Jingguo decided to allow Taiwanese who had been prevented from traveling to the mainland since the basically since the end of the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s, he decided to let Taiwanese go back to the mainland to see the people that they had left behind during this and after the Civil War. Well, a lot of those guys were very elderly who went in 1987, and they took with them their sons-in-law to carry the luggage. And the sons and sons-in-law saw in the PRC an incredible opportunity to reinvigorate the kinds of businesses that by the late 1980s in Taiwan were starting to run out of room because of the rising cost of production. So Taiwan was becoming a more developed place, wages were rising, expectations for things like environmental regulation were increasing, and it was just getting really hard to be competitive in that kind of injection molded plastic world. So immediately in 1987, you see Taiwanese entrepreneurs, the owners of these small and medium-sized contract manufacturing, export-oriented businesses going to the mainland and setting up shop and radically reducing their costs so that they could continue to service the same clients, so continue to manufacture for the same branded companies, but at a much lower price. So early on, everybody was scared to death in Taiwan, oh my gosh, we're hollowing out our economy. All of our manufacturing is going to the mainland. What's going to happen to Taiwan? So there's one more step in the Taiwan story that we have to pay attention to before I start talking really about what happened in the mainland. And that is the fact that Taiwan's economy kind of did empty out a little bit, actually created demand and space for another huge and far more high value sector to develop. And that is the high tech, ICT, and semiconductor industries. And many, many, many of the companies that we know that are household names today, Acer, Asus, TSMC, are products of this ecosystem that the Taiwanese government promoted through organizations led by the Industrial Technology Research Institute, or ITRI, in Taiwan. Okay, so all these guys go over to mainland China, and what do? Well, they do the same thing they did in Taiwan. If this photo looks a lot like the one of the welding line in the bicycle factory, it's because it's the same kind of business model in the PRC that these manufacturers were using back in Taiwan. So this is actually a photo that my host, Clayton Doobie, gave me that he took back in 1991 on the outskirts of Shanghai, where a Taiwanese manufacturer who's making pool toys has set up manufacturing in the mainland, and they're making the same thing, no doubt for the same exact clients, but at a much lower cost, because now they're paying the land cost, the labor cost, the water and electricity cost of China in the 1990s, mainland China in the 1990s, rather than Taiwan, where all of those costs were way higher. So the result of this movement of Taiwanese investors taking their businesses to the mainland was just an explosion in cross-strait trade from $5 billion in 1998 to $150 billion in 2018, and also an explosion in Taiwanese investment in the PRC. And both of these figures are using Taiwanese government statistics, so they're actually probably underestimates. So the Taishang, these Taiwanese businessmen, contributed to the PRC economy in many ways. And I'm going to talk about money, jobs, technology, management expertise, and supply chain relationships. But I'm going to tell you right up front, I think the most valuable of all was the supply chain relationships, that it would have been extremely difficult for PRC entities to develop manufacturing capacity that would have allowed them to enter global supply chains without the being introduced into those supply chains by people who were, or companies that were already embedded in them. That is, these Taiwanese companies. So money-wise, we know that between 91 and 2020, there was at least $188 billion invested from Taiwan into the PRC. But actually, it's probably 2 or 3 times that amount, because much of this investment, especially in the early years, but even right up to the present, is channeled through third parties. So it's not directly from Taiwan to the mainland, but works its way through Hong Kong, the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Cayman Islands. So while no one really knows for sure exactly how much has been invested by Taiwanese people and entities in the PRC, I think most of the most expert economists agree that Taiwan is China's second largest investor. Talking about jobs, there are many millions of, again, nobody knows. And when I asked this question, so I used to ask this question when I went to see Taishang in the mainland, and they were like, that one we're not answering, because they pay taxes per head. So the size of their workforce is the size of their tax burden. And they have a number that they give the tax authorities, and that is their number, but they were not interested in giving me a number that might not be exactly the same. So nobody really knows how many people are employed by Taiwanese investors either, but we know that it is a very large number. And it's larger, the effects are maybe disproportionate to the absolute numbers because they're so concentrated. So most Taiwanese companies are concentrated in a relatively limited number of localities. So places like Dongguan and Kunshan have massive amounts of Taiwanese investment. Xiamen, a few other places, and then many parts of China have very limited Taiwanese investment. Although as costs in the coastal regions have risen, some of the Taiwanese investors have gone inland to look for a better environment. And there's some interesting stuff in the book that I don't have time to talk about tonight about some of the challenges that come with trying to export this model, which is based on migrant labor that is disciplined by the PRC state and made available at a low cost to investors, Taiwanese, PRC, other foreign. Not all of those are available in the inland regions. Taiwanese investors also brought enormous amounts of technological innovation to the PRC, right? The PRC had heavy industry in the Mao era, but it was very limited in light and consumer industry, which is exactly what global markets want from a low cost platform. So the technology for that kind of manufacturing also needed to come from Taiwan. And then management expertise. So how do you actually organize production for these international clients? So I chose this photo or this image of Laputa, the castle in the sky from a Hayao Miyazaki movie, to sort of represent the concept that my good friend, the sociologist Chen Mingqi, developed, the fortress in the air. He said these Taiwanese communities and networks and clusters of businesses that are all working together to produce a particular item for a particular customer. They're enclosed, they're self-reliant, they really try to minimize their attachment to the PRC community in which they are located. So Taiwanese businesses, whole supply chains moved en masse to the mainland and continued the same kind of production process that they had mastered back in Taiwan. And then finally, supply chain relationships. So it's really difficult to manufacture for Nike. Nike has a lot of intellectual property that they need you to protect. They have incredibly high quality expectations. They want the contracting relationship to be smooth. They want to be able to tell their customers that they're not using sweatshop labor, and they're constantly updating their designs. So not just anybody can manufacture for Nike. So what you see is the big global brands like Nike, Adidas, Puma, Timberland, that's just shoes, or all kinds of electronic devices like Apple products, and high-end manufacturing. And Schwinn was ultimately kind of pushed aside by Taiwanese bicycle brands. But all of these companies, Yueyan, Foxconn, Giant, were Taiwanese companies that already were manufacturing for these brands in Taiwan. So when they went to the mainland and started manufacturing for those same brands, it was a smooth transition for the customer, for Nike, for Schwinn, and it was a smooth transition for the Taiwanese manufacturer. But what they discovered is that in the mainland, the labor supply, the availability of land and other resources made it possible for them to become much larger than they ever could have been if they had stayed in Taiwan. And so what did the Taishang, these Taiwanese businesses, get out of taking their operations to the mainland? A new lease on life, right? They were about to be squeezed out by lower cost manufacturing platforms as the cost of production in Taiwan got too high. But by moving to the mainland, they're able to bring their costs back down and start over on a much bigger platform. But I want to just conclude by saying something about ways in which Taiwanese have influenced the PRC that go beyond just the business part of the picture. Consumer taste, new consumer taste being imported into mainland China, the introduction of philanthropy and forms of philanthropy that had not existed, the rejuvenation of religion, traditional Chinese religion, the enlivening of popular culture in the PRC, and also, and I won't talk about this one tonight, but a lot of PRC institutions are also heavily influenced by Taiwan, especially legal institutions. So the big benefit to the PRC of having Taiwanese in the retail sector is affordable luxury. So, you know, a lot of people in the PRC can afford real luxury, so they can afford Gucci, Prada, Starbucks. But a lot of people in the PRC want to have a kind of elegant and beautiful high class experience, but they can't afford Gucci, Prada, they can't afford Starbucks. And Taiwan's special niche is to be able to marry Chinese taste and price point to the feeling of a special experience. And in fact, Taiwan has come to be kind of associated in the PRC with that more high class or deluxe experience. So wedding photography is an entire industry that came from Taiwan to the PRC. But even this contemporary ad for the Lily Garden wedding photography shop says, and the dresses are imported from Taiwan. So, you know, this is 2021, and we're still wanting a dress that feels special, and it feels special because it's imported from Taiwan. Or yes, for those of you who read Chinese, Korea is also one of the high class points of origin for wedding gowns. Also philanthropy. So the Tzuji Buddhist Compassion Relief Association was the first overseas NGO to be able to operate in China, in mainland China. And it is to this day one of the only foreign or non-PRC based organizations that is allowed to provide direct services to PRC people in need. Also, religion, these religious pilgrimages from Taiwan into the PRC reintroduced religious practices and rituals that had been dormant during the period of high Maoism, so the Cultural Revolution. A lot of people in the PRC kind of wanted to do religious practices, but those religious practices were hard to recover, and Taiwanese went to the mainland. They paid for the renovation of temples, and they built new temples. So this is a temple built by the Foguangshan religious organization in Taiwan, bringing the opportunity for traditional Chinese religious practice to reawaken in the PRC. And pop culture, from Teresa Deng, who they used to say back in the Deng Xiaoping era, Big Deng rules during the day, that's Deng Xiaoping, but Little Deng rules in the evening. That's Teresa Deng, the sweet-voiced crooner who brought love and romance back to PRC popular culture after the Cultural Revolution. Other superstars, Ame, the very popular Taiwanese singer who is still performing throughout the region and in the PRC, and someone like Jay Cho, super popular singer. Even the language as it is spoken in the PRC has been influeed by these cross currents and hybridization with Taiwan. So the idea that tongzhi, the mainland word that was introduced to capture the idea of comrades. So in the PRC, communism, you need a term that means comrades that you use as a term of address. Well, comrades in Hong Kong and then popularized in Taiwan in Mandarin came to be a kind of ironic way of saying LGBTQ. Now in Taiwan, everybody knows tongzhi means gay, but they also know that in the PRC, that Beijing LGBT Center is the Beijing Tongzhi Zhongxin. So there is another chapter, and I'm not really going to talk about this tonight because I want to get to your questions, but this is a story that's kind of coming to an end now. It is increasingly the case that the costs in the mainland are rising to the point where a lot of Taiwanese manufacturers can no longer make a profit in the PRC, and they are looking further afield for opportunities. And it is also true that many, many, many PRC companies have found their way into global supply chains and are either operating alongside Taiwanese companies or are displacing Taiwanese companies within those supply chains. So the role of Taiwanese entrepreneurs is not so critical in the PRC anymore, although they still have a lot of business there and they still do a lot of business there. But there is now something called the red supply chain, so the indigenous PRC supply chain that has to some extent replaced or kind of overtaken Taiwanese investors in the mainland. And I think I'm going to call it there and look forward to discussing all of these ideas with you.
Thank you so much for that whirlwind trip through Taiwan's economic development and the link between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland, this economic link that has had all of these other influences, right, in society and culture and that sort of thing. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to get to, including some things that you didn't address tonight, but that you talk about at some length in the book that I think are really useful for people to be aware of. But we are also receiving questions from the audience, and some of those audience members, we have a large audience, and some of them you actually cite in this book.
Okay, good.
So we have people from academia, and we also have some Taishan, some Taiwanese business people who are joining us. So we'd like to get to some of their questions as well. But let me back up back to the 1970s and, the early 1980s, because one of the interesting things that you highlight is, of course, the enticements, the efforts that the mainland made to entice outside investors, to bring in external technology, these kinds of things. And one of the names that many people are certainly familiar with, but may not associate with that is Zhou Enlai. And you highlight Zhou Enlai with the idea of special economic zones, which Deng Xiaoping will later come to power and put into place. But you also identify some of the key technocrats on the Taiwan side that helped push Taiwan's economy forward. Could you take a moment, and we'll talk about more recent leaders in just a minute, but can you take a moment to discuss the role of early leadership on both sides of the strait?
Sure. Part of why I wanted to do this book is that I'm really interested in the East Asian developmental state. And I have been ever since I read a magnificent book, Looking at the Sun by James Fallows, which just really explained how Japan could have become, the Japan that we know today, but that we were really scared of back in the mid-1980s, through this kind of collaboration between business and private ownership and government leadership, and what in Japan they called administrative guidance. And both Japan and South Korea use that developmental state apparatus to develop really large companies and to develop global brands. So everybody knows lots of, Japanese brand names, everybody knows lots of Korean brand names, but most people don't know, or they didn't know until TSMC suddenly had a chip shortage and they were on the news every day. A lot of people don't really know Taiwanese brands. So one of the things that's interesting about Taiwan is that the form that the developmental state took there was a bit different, and it focused more on enabling bottom-up entrepreneurship than on sort of picking winners and constructing big companies that were going to be able to be dominant in their sectors. So there's a lot more failure in Taiwan than maybe in Japan and Korea. Taiwanese are so tough. And this generation that became the Taishang and went to the mainland, we're so used to starting a business and having it fail. There's this whole story in the book of the swarm of bees. So there are all kinds of wonderful Chinese expressions for stuff that economists have a fancy name for, but I don't know what you call swarm of bees. But that's when everybody finds out, oh my gosh, Barbie, I'm gonna do injection molded plastics because I'm gonna be a Mattel supplier, make a Barbie. And everybody goes in and they're swarming all over it and nobody makes a profit. These Taiwanese businessmen were not protected by the state. They were and are genuine entrepreneurs. So when they get into, and there's people like KT Lee, who basically guided the Taiwanese economy from the 1940s right up until the end of his life in the 90s. They understood the virtues of the private, but they also understood the necessity for the state to enable and to create an environment in which private business could really thrive. And I think what you see in the PRC then in the early Deng Xiaoping era is sort of trying to figure out, can we do this? So TVEs are an attempt to kind of blur the line between public and private, but TVEs have these limitations that have to do with capital and markets and technology. There's like lots of reasons why TVEs couldn't take off. But I think a big reason that TVEs couldn't take off was that they didn't have a market they needed an external market in order to develop China's internal consumption power to the point where it could be sort of self-propelling. One might argue we're still in that stage today, right? There are people who would say, what China needs is a higher income society so they can buy up the stuff that they're making. But anyway, that's where the SEZs come in, because the SEZs are like a way of walling off private capital from Chinese society to see how it goes. Like, can these foreign investors really make money for us? Can they create employment for us? Well, while we're finding the answer to that, we're going to keep them in a corral. But they were so successful, and the SEZs were so powerful as a driver of growth that local governments in the adjacent, so Fujian, Guangdong, everybody on the outskirts of the SEZ is like, we need a piece of this action.
No, you tell that so well here, but also in the book, describing that and how the success of this, of course, encourages Beijing to expand these kinds of opportunities and to do these, to make it possible for not just Taiwanese, but especially Taiwanese to come in and do these kinds of things. One of the things that comes through in the book is the transfer of techniques and networks that had worked for Taiwanese business people in Taiwan, and then they bring that over, some of that same sort of thing. And you refer to clustering, you talk about networks. Perhaps the credit aspect is not so important. By the time they get to the mainland, they have plenty of capital. But maybe you could say something more about how that works and how that is part of the supply chain strength that Taiwan brings.
Yeah, one of the things that I really loved researching this book was learning about how Taiwanese business families operate. And so, some of these are generalizations, like definitely not every Taiwanese company is the same, but a lot of the SMEs they're family businesses. They start out really small. And so dad, the patriarch, makes something. And one of the examples I use in the book is the Umbrella King. So the Umbrella King makes umbrellas, and he figures out how to make umbrellas. And then as his umbrella business grows and grows, he branches into the component parts of umbrella making. So making the spines, the metal things that pop out, stretching aluminum tubing for the handles. And each of his sons gets one of those kind of component businesses. So they've got this kind of network. Dad's in charge, and he's kind of controlling how they spin stuff off, but they're also all working together. And if somebody needs money to, invest in something really expensive, they all pool their resources, and they're all kind of growing together. But if something doesn't work, you can triage it. You can just cut it off, throw it away, and start something else. And so many of these businesses are like that. And so the patriarch holds it all together until he's gone. And then they don't have to fight over who's going to be the CEO. They're all the CEO of their own thing. My total favorite Chinese saying is, it's better to be a chicken's head than a cow's ass, which is, like, be in charge of something, however small it is. It's better to be the boss than to be at the bottom. And I think that's why the high-tech revolution has been so hard for many people in Taiwan, is that you can't run it that way. A tech company has to be sort of bureaucratized, and, it's got its engineering function. And it's hard, I think, for a lot of these kind of what they call black hand bosses. That is, guys who actually learned the business by doing the manufacturing process with their own hands. It can be hard for them to trust this other kind of organization with their money.
Yeah, that comes through very much in the book, talking about this sort of thing. But those networks would exist beyond the family connections, and you build these kinds of things, and that adds a certain resilience, a certain flexibility, and agility that you highlight. If I could, for a moment, ask you to talk a little bit about the relationship between these business people, the folks who've created these business, and they've brought it to the mainland, and in some cases they brought their managers as well, that sort of thing. But over time, those folks get replaced. In part, it's a deliberate strategy to develop talent, and in part, it's just a necessity, since your employees are all from whatever place, be it Xiamen, Dongguan, wherever it might be. Can you say something about that relationship and the learning that happened as part of, this business enterprise?
Yeah. So a lot of Taiwanese business owners initially really wanted the Ganpu, right? They wanted their white collar staff also to be from Taiwan. But it got really expensive. In addition to the variables that you're mentioning, it's also just really expensive. They want a premium over their salary in Taiwan, even though margins are lower in the mainland. So I think for various reasons, also the necessity to cultivate relationships with local officials, which are a hugely important part of this whole story. It was necessary to bring PRC citizens into business. And that can be really dangerous because they can sometimes replicate what you're doing. And because they are local, their relationships are better. And, you find yourself kind of undercut. And there are just as there were lots of Taiwanese businesses that failed in Taiwan during the era of, SME explosion, there are lots of businesses that have failed in the mainland too. And there are whole organizations devoted to kind of telling people, don't go over there, it's not safe. They'll take your business, they'll take your technology, they'll take your know-how, whatever. But I think on the whole, Taiwanese have accumulated a just massive amount of money. It's hard to imagine how much wealth has been generated through this collaboration. And one of the benefits to people in the PRC is the opportunity to work in these organizations and to become leaders and to create their own businesses, not necessarily in the same sector or niche, but to be able to have the skills and the connections to be able to manufacture for international clients.
And that really is evident. And in some cases, competitors. In some cases, these folks might become suppliers. All sorts of possibilities. Now, in just a moment, we're going to shift to today, and we'll shift also to tomorrow. A lot of the questions that people have been asking have been speculative ones, asking about what if. But one more question here, focusing on, again, leadership, because one of the things that comes through your book is that although we associate warming relations between Taiwan and the mainland with the Ma Ying-jeou years, in fact, you highlight all these things that really developed under Chen Shui-bian, the Democratic Progressive Party leader who preceded Ma. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because the legacy of both, Chen's efforts to create some sort of what he considered to be a normal relationship that would involve trade, would involve, tourism, these kinds of things. And then the more explicit efforts that Ma Ying-jeou made to put in place treaties, legal agreements that would provide some protection for some of the business practices, some means of adjudicating disputes, those sorts of things. So if you could say something about, those first 16 years of the 21st century with those two administrations.
Yeah, one of the great ironies of this whole story is that Taiwanese business in the mainland has flourished when it has been unregulated and no one was in charge. It's really, the collaboration is the product of local officials in the PRC who wanted to do something for their communities. And, some people would say, well, they also wanted to do something for themselves. And of course they did, but they were bringing wealth to poor people who had no opportunities or who had very limited opportunities. And they created opportunities for them. So they really wanted to grow their local economies, and this was how they could do it, and they did it. So they were doing that, the mountains are high, the emperor's far away kind of thing too. But the Taiwanese businesses were, we have no protection at all. This is the Wild West. They relied on each other. So there's also a lot in the book about the Taiwanese business associations, which kind of banded together to help Taishan navigate challenges and catastrophes in the mainland. But the more regulation and the more sort of institutionalized the interactions became, in some ways, the more halting and difficult further progress was. And I don't think it's really the fault of the Ma administration, but I think what the Ma administration was doing was, first of all, they were trying to make this happen with a new kind of industry that is just very different from light manufacturing for export. But also they were trying to negotiate a two-way street, right? Up until 2012, it was a one-way street. And Ma wanted to institutionalize a more symmetrical relationship. And that symmetrical relationship scared the living daylights out of a lot of people in Taiwan. And I didn't see it coming. I don't think anybody really understood what the effect of having the money and the people coming the other way was going to be on Taiwanese sentiment. But I think a big part of how things kind of went off the rails between 2012 and 2014 was just the kind of, in the book, I talk about the increase in the number of PRC tourists in Taiwan from 0 to like 4 million in 5 years' time. So that was scary.
And as you say, when it's profits flowing back, to Taiwan, that's one thing. But now you have tourists, and that is generating income for some businesses and those sorts of things. But as you highlight in the book, inequality expands in Taiwan during this period. It also grows on the mainland, and it certainly grows in the United States at the same time. But that is one of the factors that leads to the Sunflower Movement, the occupation of the Legislative Yuan, and all of those sorts of things. This is really one of the truly interesting parts of the book, together with all of the cultural impact. You gave us a couple of slides here, but there are full chapters devoted to 85 degrees and the wedding photo industry and a whole lot more. In the question of affordable luxury, how can I deliver a 5-star experience at a 2-star price? Those kinds of discussions are covered at some length in the book. But I need to bring in some of the questions that have been raised here. So before I do that, a reminder: everybody should be getting this book. There's so much. We don't we simply don't have time to explore all of it. It's an incredibly rich and powerful story. These individual examples of entrepreneurs, of officials, and a whole lot more. But we have some concrete questions. And so first, one of the things that some foreign businesses have complained about is the difficulty of getting money out of China. They have success making it, but I shouldn't say repatriating it, but bringing it to wherever they want to bring it is a problem. Could you say something about the experience of the Taiwanese business people?
Yes, it's a problem for them too, and it has been for a long time. One of the reasons maybe why there is so much Taiwanese investment is that it's easier to reinvest in the mainland than to try and find a way to get your money out. But it's also true that a lot of money does find its way out. And that leads to the problem of inequality and so on. But yes, they don't have a secret formula or a special deal that makes it easy for them to get their money out.
Okay, so some of the same issues that confront businesses from outside the mainland confront these Taiwanese businesses as well. One of the questions that we've got concerns the Belt and Road and whether or not Taiwanese companies are playing a part in that. I have anecdotal experience with this, but maybe you might say something more about the ability of Taiwanese companies to take advantage of these big initiatives. In your book, you highlight, the 5-year plans, the Made in China, 2025 plan, that sort of thing. Is there space on the Belt and Road for some of these Taiwanese companies?
I would be very interested to hear, your anecdotal stories on that, because, my first thought is no, for 2 reasons. One is that the PRC is not going to be welcoming that kind of contractor.
Yeah.
Actually, the PRC doesn't even really welcome contractors from the country where they're building the thing, much less, Taiwanese contractors. And then number 2 is that, Taiwan is not that big in infrastructure. For example, Taiwan has a huge alternative energy commitment, and a lot of it is foreign companies doing that work in Taiwan. So like their wind power, which is a rapidly expanding energy sector for Taiwan, is Danish and Dutch, but I think mostly Danish. So I don't know what they would, what lines of business would align with the Belt and Road, even if they could get in. But what Taiwan is trying to do is encourage export manufacturing in the same countries that are targeted by the Belt and Road, not Central Asia. Central Asia is China's backyard, but Southeast Asia and South Asia are strong targets of Taiwanese business promotion.
Yeah, there's already been considerable investment in some of those places. And certainly if you can export along this way, it makes a great deal of sense. The stories that I'd be in a position to share are all sad ones. So there's not stories of great success. And they all involve companies that are related to, moving things along the Belt and Road, providing certain kinds of services. Let's shift, if we could. One last question for a snapshot, and that's someone asked for a comparison between the impact of Hong Kong business and the impact of Taiwanese business.
So the answer is somewhere along the line, I decided I just wasn't going to do that. You said that I had a short career, but somebody at a faculty meeting today told me that I've been at Davidson College 29 years. So I didn't think I had enough time left to do Hong Kong as well. I mean, my sense of Hong Kong is that the that their investment was more localized in southern China. And Taiwan certainly was localized in Fujian, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and southern China as well. But I don't know enough to answer that question well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And now let's move into the what might happen realm. So we need a little bit of your well-informed crystal ball on this. And we have a series of questions that move along the lines of, okay, in the push and pull between the United States and China, what happens for Taiwan? How are Taiwanese companies trying to cope? We certainly know about Taiwanese companies, having to cope with changing or attitudes towards the Taiwanese government. The 85 degrees example comes to mind. But maybe you could say something a little bit more about how this tech challenge, especially since you write so eloquently about TSMC and others in your book.
Yeah, I think, decoupling between the US and the PRC has a lot of risk for Taiwan. The TSMC, a major customer of TSMC has been Huawei. And when the US basically said, we all have to shun Huawei, cut Huawei out of our networks, at that time, it was possible to replace that demand. But that's not a strategy, for long-term success, to just sort of say, whenever Uncle Sam says you can't sell to those guys, go find another customer, because other customers are hard to find. So I think that it is a real challenge, because a lot of Taiwanese companies are really dug in the PRC. A company like Foxconn, they make on my iPhone, they can't move. There's nowhere in the world where you can get 600,000 people in the same city to work for the same employer. That just doesn't exist. So they're diversifying by constructing plants outside of the PRC, but the basic iPhone assembly stuff, that is really hard to move. So they're working on automation, try to get a lot of robots so that they don't have to have all those people. But decoupling is a real challenge for Taiwan. And I think it also feels kind of symbolic, because I also think politically it's not good for Taiwan. And so now I'm moving away from the content of my book a little bit to make more of a political statement. But it worries me greatly when I see Americans who think that the way to be pro-Taiwan is to be anti-China, because Taiwan is right next to the PRC, and it is very intertwined with the PRC, and it is vulnerable to the PRC. So that's not to say that the way to take care of Taiwan is just to roll over and give Beijing everything they want, but it is to be smart and not just to be kind of a knee-jerk anti-China policy, because a knee-jerk anti-China policy sooner or later will come back to bite Taiwan.
Yeah, I don't think people in Taiwan ever lose sight of the geography,
Yes,
but unfortunately, some people outside do and may not fully understand, too, that China's rise in many respects has been very, very good for Taiwan. Certainly for the business people making money, for the people who want to sell wedding photo packages to those couples, to the people who are going to lounge in cafes or hotels or any number of other, of these sorts of businesses. Or in other days, they may have taken a package tour that took them to Sun Moon Lake and that sort of thing. So certainly China's rise changes the dynamic but in many respects, it's been good. And you highlight in your book that when many markets were closed because of the great financial crisis, the fact that China was open for business was of benefit to Taiwan. So I think that really comes through in your book. I wanted to close, though, with a question where your book, takes us. The last several chapters that are focusing on the cultural influences, the social influences, things like that. The expectation, of course, is that contact is to increase knowledge, increase understanding, lessen fears, that sort of thing. But in some respects, that hasn't happened. And I was wondering if you could, conclude with a statement about, what are the legacies of this, at first, weird sort of development where nobody had a plan, but Taiwanese businesses plunged in, and how that has played out.
So, one of the things that kind of drives me crazy is that there are a lot of people out there who want to say that there was a golden age of cross-strait relations back before all of this Taiwanese identity and independence stuff wrecked it. When I went to Taiwan for the first time in 1982, the mainland China was called Gongfei, communist bandits. And people really meant, no one had ever been there who wasn't, who hadn't been there in uniform 40 years earlier. People hadn't been there. They didn't know people there was just no interaction. And there was a lot of fear and hostility. So this opportunity to know each other, I think, has mitigated a lot of that fear and hostility and created a lot of opportunities for, although in my book, I point out that there is no such thing as win-win in China. This is something that I learned from reading Taishang literature, but it was kind of a win-win thing. I think the problem is that ultimately in the PRC, there is this ambition for unification or annexation of Taiwan that makes how friendly people can be limited. It limits how close and how much trust can exist, because everybody in Taiwan kind of knows, like a lot of people say, I'm not worried because I know, like Taishang that you talked to this, I'm not worried. Taiwanese, the mainland people are all about business. They just want to get money. We're working well together. There's no reason for something bad to happen. And people in Taiwan say, why would they attack us? That's so dumb. But we all know that, churning in the background for the PRC leadership at all times, and now increasingly projected onto the PRC population, is this idea that the existence of Taiwan as it is today is an affront and has to be, that affront needs to be addressed. And so, I feel like we got another 40 years of peace and stability, but the truth is that the PRC is not clearly committed in the long run to peace and stability, and no amount of friendliness on the Taiwan side is going to change that.
That comes through in the book. I won't quote you exactly because I've forgotten the exact words, but you talk about ambiguity and ambivalence being baked in, that there are opportunities, but also hazards. And that is no less true today than it has been. And in fact, you've highlighted the issue of vulnerability with all of your eggs in this proverbial basket, that and you mentioned that also in your comments when you were talking about it's easier to find a supplier than to find a customer, and to do these kinds of things. Professor Shelley Rigger, I just want to say thank you for your wonderful presentation, for your openness and clarity in the Q&A section. I also want to thank you for this wonderful book that I hope everybody who's joined us today and everybody who watches this subsequent video will go out and get. It's a terrific resource. But I also want to thank all of the people who are with us now and who have chosen to learn more about the relationship across the Taiwan Strait and its really fascinating history. Thank you, Shelley. It's been terrific.
You are very welcome. I hope we do this again soon in person.
That would be ideal. Come on over to LA.
Okay.
Friends, thank you all